Now, today's developments will cause further devastation for Victorian businesses and put enormous pressure on many households. And I would argue it's proof that Victoria's hotel quarantine program remains suspect, and the government clearly has little faith in the state's contact tracing system, which, as we know, failed so spectacularly during the second wave. For at least the next 5 days, we'll see schools closed, weddings cancelled, masks become mandatory indoors and outdoors across the state, and we'll see livelihoods take another hit as stay-at-home orders come into effect with only 4 legal reasons to leave your house. But, Nick, tennis players are apparently essential workers, and the Australian Open will continue. Does that make sense to you? Tennis players essential, schools not essential?
Well, look, Rita, my understanding is that athletes have been categorised as essential workers. So that covers tennis players in the Australian Open, but also other professional athletes. Of course, there'll be no crowds at any of these professional sporting events. So, the tens of thousands of people who would have turned up to the games at the Australian Open this weekend won't be able to. But we will at least still be able to sit at home and watch the games, and hopefully that provides some succour for us during a very challenging couple of days that we're obviously going into.
No, thank you. This is about the last thing I want to do, because it's all about consistency, and we talked last week about a proportional response. I would argue a 5-day harsh lockdown across the state, including areas that haven't had a single case of COVID for months. I would argue that's not a proportional response. It's also not proportional for Dan Andrews to lock out Victorians out of their own state, as he did January 2 this year, stranding thousands in New South Wales, but also welcome in hundreds of tennis players and their hangers-on and media from COVID hotspots around the world. I mean, really, was that a stress the Victorian quarantine system needed?
Well, look, I know that the tennis players is a source of annoyance for you. It's a major event, and look, it's going ahead, and look, many people will get enjoyment out of watching the game. In terms of the overall response today and the 5-day lockdown, of course, that is consistent, Rita, with the lockdowns we've seen recently in Queensland and Western Australia. And in both of those cases, you had the new UK variant, which is known to be hyper infectious and travels at very fast speed as well, highly transmissible.
In those cases, even the households of the infected didn't get infected. So we kept being told these drastic actions need to be taken. WA locked up for 1 case. Brisbane, same thing. South Australia, wetting the bed again. All because of this new strain that is supposed to be so contagious, and yet in the cases that we know of in this country, even people within the household in Queensland, for example, weren't infected. I'm not disputing that this strain is more infectious, but it's just as infectious in New South Wales as it is in Victoria, and I would argue if this strain was in New South Wales, they would again trust their contact tracing to contain this virus instead of locking down their citizens.
Well, the UK strain was first detected in the UK in around September. It is now the dominant strain in that country and across most of Europe. Of course, in Britain today, there was 13,500 cases of coronavirus UK strain, and there was around 680 deaths. Now, that's what we want to avoid here in Victoria. That's what they wanted to avoid in Western Australia and in Queensland, and that's why they moved very quickly when they realised that there was a patient with this new strain in their state. They moved drastically, dramatically, and ultimately it needs to be said effectively in those 2 states to shut down and contain the problem, and that's what's going to happen in Victoria as well, Rita.
Yeah, OK, and I have criticised WA, South Australia and Queensland for their bedwetting response, just as I'm criticising the Victorian one. You seem to think it's world's best practice to lock down the whole state for 1 case. Comparing Victoria to UK is frankly absurd. We've got borders closed. We don't have that situation. Compare us to New South Wales if you want to compare us to anybody. And why should Victorians trust this Premier, who only days ago was claiming laughably that other states were copying Victoria's hotel quarantine program. Of course, when he was asked to name a single state that was copying Victoria, he couldn't. Have a look at this.
How can you say that Victoria has higher standards than New South Wales when it comes to hotel quarantine, when New South Wales is taking more return travellers safely a week, and we've had 2 leaks in the last week?
Well, I can say it because it's true, and whether that's convenient for people or not is not really my concern. There's not 3,500 private security working in our system. Do I need to go any further than that? Now, this is not about boasting, so this is just a fact. If it was anything other than a good system, then I doubt very much that other First Ministers across the country would have agreed to copy it.
Can't name a single state that's copying Victoria's program. And remember, at the height of the second wave, when we knew the contact tracing wasn't working in Victoria, again, the laughable claim was made that other states are going to copying Victoria's contact tracing program. In fact, New South Wales was named as, and they came out and said, no, we're not. That's the last thing we're doing. Now, New South Wales right now is the only state that hasn't fully or partially closed its borders to Victorians. We've seen Queensland, WA, South Australia, even Tasmania and the ACT. I would argue it's pretty gracious of Gladys to do that, given Victoria shut its borders with New South Wales at the start of the year when they were only recording, I think on the day the borders were shut, they had 10 cases.
Look, certainly New South Wales has been the standout in terms of keeping borders open. Let's see what happens over the next 24 hours regarding the New South Wales-Victoria border. You've got to remember, though, Rita, that we are talking here about the UK strain, which is far more infectious than the earlier strains that we've seen and travels more quickly as well.
Then
and
why
so,
the tennis come in?
what we're seeing with South Australia and Western Australia is them responding, and these other states responding to that risk.
If that is the mindset you're going to take, that this UK strain is so contagious that a single case necessitates a lockdown of a whole state, then why would you invite hundreds of tennis players and media and associated staff to come into the country when we knew that strain was running rampant throughout Europe? That makes no sense. You either are super risk averse and you don't invite that in, or you take some measure of risk and you have a proportional, nuanced response like New South Wales has had.